have discussed before about climate politics, and as I mentioned in the last podcast, human beings tend to be attached to their political beliefs in pretty much every context. And here this chapter is titled, "Oh yes it is, oh no it isn't." So here we will read about a polar bear that never existed. So there are people who say if it disappears then it never existed maybe, and why some people pretend as if there is nothing wrong, and how hard it is to make a deal with 195 countries, because when you want climate action to save the planet, everybody has to reduce their emissions and do the right thing. And they can't always do it because they are poor, they don't have energy, they don't have enough solar, renewable, whatever, and all of them have to agree, and this is very, very difficult. We'll see why statues' faces are disappearing, because protesters wanting governments to take action are beginning to do funny things. Protests are taking some forms that not everybody agrees with, and we will see why we need to wrap up the deserts, maybe develop solar panels to cover them, and who has been a bit silly in this whole thing, and why I am a climate denier too. In short, we will learn about the squabbling about climate change, and probably if you don't speak good English, squabbling basically means arguing, fighting, and so on. So here is a poor polar bear standing on a little piece of sea ice floe surrounded by water around, and saying, "This is not what I expected." So Bogus the bear, who hasn't seen it? The lonely polar bear floating on an ice floe in the sea, no sign of land or icy expanses for miles around. The photograph is often used to illustrate articles about climate change, to show how quickly the ice is melting and how badly things are going for the polar bears. This is kind of an example that was used repeatedly. The thing is that polar bear never stood on that ice floe. The photographer clearly combined them using multiple photographs. He even took the sky from another photograph. Bogus means fake or imitation. So Bogus the bear means a fake bear or an imitation. It seems like a good name for this particular bear. The photographer wanted to make a powerful picture, he said, which is fine, of course, but the photo appeared in all kinds of newspapers and all kinds of websites talking about climate change and how dire the situation is for the polar bear and how dangerous climate change has become for some species. And now people think that most polar bears are floating around sadly in the Arctic Ocean. Try googling some pictures for polar bear. What do you see? Apart from Bogus, you'll find almost entirely pictures of polar bears nicely surrounded by snow and ice. Well, yes, there is another fake bear. The one looks even sadder than Bogus, and it's frantically clinging on to a last piece of sea ice that really is too fake for words. But there is also a real bear on an ice floe. It looks really thin and sad. Is that the proof that North Pole is melting? Maybe the bear is sick or injured and not really starving. If you find a dead moose, you don't immediately think if you find a dead mouse, you don't immediately think all mice are dying out, do you? And one sad polar bear doesn't prove climate change or that ice floe is disappearing and so on. So here is a sad polar bear. Here is one desperately clinging on to the last ice floe. But people use these photos to shout, "You see, the climate's changing, the earth is getting warmer, the poles are melting." They should shout loud because they want to convince the other people. They shout it loud because they want to convince other people, because not everyone believes that climate change is real, and if they do believe it, they often think there is nothing that humans can do about it, that it's such a big problem, somebody else has to do something about it. But what would you do if someone tried to convince you with a fake photograph? you wouldn't believe them at all anymore. Why would you believe someone who lies or really exaggerates things? There is a big game of oh yes it is and oh no it isn't that is going on. One person says one thing, another person says something else, and another person doesn't know half of what's going on. So maybe you are listening to these podcasts and learning a lot of things, and then somebody else is telling you something, saying, don't believe anything you hear from this guy. That's not the best way to tackle a problem that the whole world is facing. And in the meantime, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere just keeps merrily rising and rising. And this is not a science we can deny, because CO2 can be measured precisely and accurately every day, every minute. Oil companies are still searching for new sources of energy because they think we'll continue to burn fossil fuels and they'll keep making money. And hundreds of new coal-fired power stations open every year, especially in Asia, China, India, and so on, because people say climate change, it's no big deal, or they say it's not our fault, or it's not the first time, it's always changed. And they also say it will all be okay, we'll find a way. Well, is this really true? Earth is heating up, CO2, CO2, CO2. It is and it isn't. It's not okay, says Al Gore. It's okay, says Willie Soon, and climate pessimist says we are finished, there is not much we can do. And people argue about whether it's 2-degree warming or 4-degree warming, and they say what's the big deal if it's warmer by 4 degrees. But in the meantime, 97% of the climate experts agree, and only 3% of the climate deniers say it isn't happening, it's no big deal, and so on. Right? I am a climate scientist, and I am telling you we can measure CO2, we know exactly what happens when CO2 increases, and we are seeing the impacts already. So is it really no big deal? Let's hear about it's no big deal first. That's what the climate deniers say. It's a bit strange of an expression, climate deniers, because they are not denying that the climate exists. They just think that climate change will not be that bad, and that it's not because of human activity, or that there is not much we can do about it anyways. You could also call them climate skeptics, or even climate optimists, that they think it's not dangerous, it's no big deal. But we'll stick with the climate deniers for now. They say that it's no big deal, which is strange because there is an awful lot of evidence already that it is definitely a big deal. You may want to figure out also for yourself what is the difference between skepticism and cynicism. Cynicism is when you say, nah, I don't believe it. Skepticism may be a good thing because you say, show me that climate is changing, convince me, and if the science is correct, they may believe you. But climate cynics will not, deniers will not believe you no matter what. Okay? 97% of the scientists are certain that climate change is real and is caused by humans. That 97% includes a lot of scientists who have specialized in the subject like me. The 3% with doubts includes more scientists from other fields than climate sciences, or there are also people who are not scientists at all. So the more someone knows about it, the more certain they are that climate is changing and that we are driving the change. That doesn't mean that scientists know everything. I don't know everything, but I can see what's happening. The climate's far too complicated for that to understand everything very easily. They don't know, for instance, exactly how sensitive the climate is. What does that mean? How much will the earth warm up if the amount of CO2 doubles, let's say from the pre-industrial level of 280, if we reach 560? I cannot tell you exactly how much it will warm, especially in your backyard, because this is a very, very difficult problem. One scientist says 2 degrees, another one says 4 degrees, as we saw here. That's quite a difference. It's the same for the increase in the sea level. Will it be 1 meter, 2 meters, or 7 meters? So scientists keep on doing research, writing reports, and having endless discussions that helps them to understand better and better how our climate is changing. However, you often hear that people don't believe in climate change as if it's about Santa Claus. In 2006, a movie came out that tried to change that. Actually, it was more like a filmed talk. It was Al Gore giving the talk, a man who had almost become the President of the United States. On a big screen, he showed a picture of the hockey stick from Chapter 3 that we looked at before from Michael Mann and his colleagues. And Al Gore went up in a scissor lift to show the highest point of the graph because he had it on a big screen and he wanted to see how far up it was. It was one of the many devices he used to convince people about the dangers of climate change. The movie was a big success. It was called An Inconvenient Truth. So it's truth, but it's not convenient, so we don't want to believe it. Like, you may be eating candies even though your mom told you it's bad for you, and maybe you know it's bad for you, but you just can't resist. Hundreds of schools took their students to see Al Gore and bought stacks of DVDs of Al Gore's movie, and Al Gore made a lot of people aware of climate change, but not everyone. If you are not from America and you don't know who Al Gore is, don't worry about it. Or even if you are from America and you are very young, you probably don't know who Al Gore is or never heard of him, but Al Gore is still around and he's still working on climate related things, on energy and so on and so forth. So there are still some people who believe that climate change is a myth, that it's just a story, or that it's all to do with sunspots or some other thing. People like the American scientist Willie Soon. He has published various articles in which he writes that humans hardly have any influence on climate change and it's more about the sun. But he didn't mention that his research was funded by the American oil companies, which means he's taking money from people who want him to deny climate change. Is it a coincidence that he gets money from oil companies and say climate change is not real? Oil companies want to make us believe, of course, that fossil fuels are completely harmless. Otherwise, they might as well just pack up their drilling rigs and gas stations. Okay? So let's read a bit more. That's why in 1989 they started a club of sorts. Around 50 companies from the world of oil, gas, coal and cars deliberately started sowing doubt about the theory of global warming. They did this by paying scientists like Willie Soon. They helped to generate stories that started journalists doubting about climate change. They kept going on about uncertainties in climate science without mentioning the many things that are already very, very certain. And they made a film in which they actually said that CO2 would put an end to famine because warming was good for agriculture and more CO2 was good for agriculture. The group had copied these tactics from cigarette manufacturers of the past. They had known for a long time that smoking was unhealthy. The smoking companies did not want smokers to realize that it was bad, and they certainly didn't want regulations to come along that would discourage smoking. Now you look at a pack of cigarettes, it has all kinds of dangerous dangerous images on it about people getting sick and getting cancer and dying and so on. So cigarette companies paid people to sow doubt in academic journals and at medical congresses. They cigarette companies shouted that it was not at all certain that smoking was unhealthy. The same way, climate deniers now who shout that it's not at all certain that climate change is the result of human activity. There are climate deniers who are doing this even today in newspapers and on TV. The sowers of doubt get to speak almost as often as the climate scientists. So if you have a climate scientist on a show talking about climate change and its impacts, there will be a denier saying exactly the opposite. Because journalists like to present two sides of a story, which is how they are trained to study or report issues that sometimes make it seem as if 50% of the people have doubts about climate change, even though only about 3% are arguing the other side. As a result, people start thinking that maybe climate change isn't a big deal, that actually suits them just fine. They can go on driving their big cars, turning up the heat and flying off for vacations, or using air conditioners and eating meat and so on. The producers of fossil energy certainly have no objections, because they can keep on digging up fossil fuels, finding new sources and selling them at gas stations and so on. They are making good money, of course, just like cigarette manufacturers go on making money out of coughing smokers, even though they know that their own products are causing harm to people. People cannot quit smoking no matter what the message on the cigarette pack says. Similarly, some people are unable to quit fossil fuels, and they will just deny climate change. Right? So this is humanity for us. We'll come back and see how people also say it's somebody else's fault, which to some extent is true. We said CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere have come from 280 parts per million by volume at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to now 427 something, 424, 25 right now. Who created this accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere? We kind of know, so we'll come back and discuss that and see what the consequences of this kind of denial or blaming somebody